I've been with Natural Motion now for 8 years, a bit more. And when I started off, we were focused mainly on creating animation and simulation technology for visual effects, so film effects used in Hollywood films. Subsequently moving into technology for animation in AAA console games, and more recently, obviously, moving into development on mobile platforms. And it's really amazing how quickly we're in a position where the technology that we were only a few years ago looking at for high-end visual effects is now relevant already to mobile. And really what I want to do today is just talk through some of the things that we've kind of learnt along the way and talk about kind of the importance of characters and animation to mobile. But I think before I get that far, I kind of want to establish the basis that I'm working from, which is looking at the importance of 3D in general to mobile, and answer really whether we can expect high-end mobile to all be 3D pretty soon. Because I think there's an association that people make when they look at casual versus hardcore and 2D versus 3D. And tend to assume that these are the two sides of the same argument. But really, the difference when you're looking at kind of casual and hardcore, and therefore kind of mainstream and niche gaming, is much more about the kind of audience you're looking at, the complexity of gameplay, rather than the technical complexity and the issues around kind of 3D and 2D. And obviously, all console games are pretty much all 3D now. Should we expect the same from mobile? Maybe there's a difference in the audience. I think to answer that, it's quite interesting looking at what's happened historically with film, with animated movies. In this case, we're looking at the kind of timeline from the US side of things. And for years and years, everything was obviously 2D. But then around the kind of mid-90s, between that kind of Lion King, Toy Story time, once the technology was there for 3D, obviously the filmmakers switched over and embraced new 3D technology. And crucially, the audiences, these mainstream audiences who are now our audiences for mobile games, also switched over and never looked back. People want 3D, people like what you can do with 3D, and they can engage with it. And I completely believe that games will follow that same path. And as I say, the gating factor for movies was technology. I believe we've got a similar situation with mobile, and we're already at the point where mobile technology is absolutely there for 3D. These are some performance graphs supplied by, I think, NVIDIA, the data comes from. But essentially what we're looking at is very soon, current mobile will exceed current generation console in terms of performance. So we know that's not an issue. What is an issue at the moment is just the costs of working in 3D. And I think naturally there'll be fewer developers that can make this transition and afford to work in 3D, but that doesn't affect the audience. Once people are used to playing 3D casual games, I suspect we're not going to see them move back to 2D from that. But looking at those movies, there's another very, very important part about them. It's not all about 2D or 3D or whatever. One of the key parts of all of those movies is the characters in them. And I think that having compelling, believable characters is really key to the storytelling in the movies, and generally, storytelling in whatever medium you're working in. Very few stories can work without characters. And the importance of characters is really that players can become attached to them, they can become engaged with what's happening with their players, with their characters. So one example we've seen is in our own game, in My Horse, which, if you don't know, is it's kind of a horse ownership game. And what it centers around is having an actual kind of 3D horse, very high-end visuals of this horse. And what we see is actually players who have basically gone through the game, they've gone through the content, they're in the end game. They keep coming back. And what they keep coming back for is to attend to this horse. They've got kind of engaged with it, they've got involved with that character. And I think this is a very important point, that really creating great characters in your games can lead to much better engagement from consumers, and therefore better retention as well, which is pretty well good for everyone. But what is it that makes a character potentially engaging in a game. The key thing really is that this character needs to be credible and it needs to be consistent. You need to be able to believe in it. And believing in it means that it's got to exist properly in the game world, in the game fiction. You can't have things that pull you out of the immersion of believing in this character. But one important point to realize is this doesn't mean that I'm suggesting everything has to be realistic. And in fact, realism is, it's essentially just one art style you can choose to go with. And to be honest, it's probably about the hardest one you can choose to go for. Trying to make something realistic leads you towards the problems that we call uncanny valley. The idea that as you get towards perfect realism, what you get is actually quite disturbing kind of zombie-like characters where you notice all the subtle flaws. But your character does need to feel credible. It needs to feel part of your game. And really key to this is to understand this isn't all about the graphics. This isn't all about what a screenshot looks like. This is much more about how your character actually interacts with the world, how it exists in the game. And a key part of that is looking at your character animation, how your character moves in your game world. And one really interesting thing to do, which I'd recommend people do at some point, is watch probably someone else playing a game. You can just about do it yourself, but certainly if you watch other people play a game, and watch how the characters move in the game. And compare that as though you're watching an animated movie. And what you'll see is, even on the best AAA console titles, there are huge faults with the way that characters move. Classic examples is you take a character and you walk it into a wall, what happens? Odds are, in most games, that character keeps moving as though it's walking, but just kind of sliding along a wall. Certainly, if you have characters walking, bumping them into objects, into other characters, you won't see a natural interaction. Characters kind of ignore each other, they ignore the world. And what we've seen really is that the mainstream audience is actually much more sensitive to these kinds of problems than the kind of hardcore gaming audience. And part of this is the fact that they kind of lack that implicit understanding of the rules of games. As a gamer, what's a piece of scenery you can likely interact with. What's foreground, what's background. With the mainstream players, you don't get so much of that. You get a lot more kind of questioning of, why can't I do this? Why can't I pick this thing up? Why can't my character climb up this object or step over this thing? And I think actually with mobile, you've got some compounding problems with the kind of interfaces you tend to get with touch, where on a console title, each button's going to do something, and that's basically your set of actions. Once you've got a more indirect approach, particularly if you've got touch approaches where you're basically touching to move somewhere, touching to interact with an object, your players are going to expect your character to be able to just deal with that. And that means your character's going to have to do an awful lot of animation. You're going to have characters that can do all kinds of different actions to really be compelling and properly engaging. And the bad news really for mobile is the scaling effects that you see as you scale down from kind of console to high-end mobile titles don't necessarily apply in the same way as you might expect. So animation production is generally a pretty substantial part of production budget for a AAA title. And when you reduce from those budgets to what you'd need for high-end mobile, you quite often get away with just reducing assets. So you don't create as big a world, you remove levels, all of those kind of things. You can simplify bits of gameplay as well. But that doesn't necessarily reduce the amount of animation you need for your characters, right? Because a character that needs to be able to walk around a room needs pretty much the same animation as a character that's going to be able to walk around a whole building or around a whole city. You're going to have to create that same content. And so there are reasonably few options you've got really for reducing those costs, other than things like having kind of fewer characters. So what I really want to do now is to just start talking through how to manage the kind of costs and the production times on animation, and look at where you can make things most efficient. And to start, really, you've got to think about animation from the outset. If you're doing a 3D character-based game, you've got to really think, for every feature you want in that game, what's the animation cost? What do I have to do for this? So an example on our backbreaker game for mobile compared to the console version, because we didn't include anything to do with the line of scrimmage, anything to do with passing play, we could cut out huge parts of the animation network. And just adding one extra little feature of gameplay would have required adding in hundreds and hundreds of these animations. Another big thing is to say, actually, don't cut down on the amount, just reuse it. Be smart. If you're going to be doing multiple titles, invest in building up your library of motion and your understanding of animation, and try and think about standardizing your character rigs. Understand how you can reuse your assets from one title to another. And obviously part of that you've really got to consider whether you're going to have very different art styles between titles and how you might reuse. But really the key message here is let other people do the really hard work. Use the right tools, use the right technology. There's a lot out there now in terms of animation production technology. And this is where mobile has a big advantage over console, is you don't tend to have huge amounts of legacy technology for 3D. Most people who are looking at 3D on mobile are looking at it pretty fresh. And it's the right time to look at what's out there. So to start running through the kind of different aspects of putting animation into your games. The first stage is what I'll refer to as clip creation. It's what people think of as real animation. It's creating the motions in the first place. And it's certainly going to be the most time-consuming and probably therefore the most expensive stage of production. But yet it's obviously essential to all the kind of quality and style that you're going to have in your motion at the end. And really the best advice I can give on this is plan and plan well. Create the animation that you need. Don't build up a huge library of stuff just in case. But equally, if you underproduce, you're going to need to be able to turn around new assets quickly. And being able to quickly iterate, and we'll see this as we go through, being able to quickly iterate is always essential. So when you're looking at how you produce your animation, make sure you've got the ability to turn around quickly. And one option on that is to outsource, and there's obviously a lot of opportunity to outsource for animation. That's probably a whole separate talk in itself. I won't go into that, but obviously it can be cost effective. You need to get a good partner to work with, so you're not going to be held up by them. But one thing I would suggest people would look at is mocap, motion capture. There's some really good new tech out there. So this is something we've been experimenting with internally in our studio recently. We found some commercial software that you can get for a few $100s, hook it up to a PC with 4 webcams, and we've got the ability now to turn around a motion capture shoot within a day. We can set up the rig, shoot a load of motion, our animators can process it and clean it up and have it in-game within a day, and this has cost us a few $100s. These options really do work now. It's pretty impressive stuff. The other thing that's pretty new is the online solutions. So if you looked at Mixamo, for example, you've got people providing online services for essentially producing animation assets directly on the web. You can set up animation blends and so on and pull down animation that's retargeted onto your characters. I'd have a concern that a lot of people won't be able to get the style that they want for their games to really have compelling characters by using third-party systems, but I would say they're definitely worth looking at. Now, where things start to get interesting is once you've got a bunch of animations, what are you going to do with them in your game? And this is where animation blending and transitioning starts to really come in and makes a lot of sense. And this is really, I think, the biggest differentiator between a 3D game that looks really, really simple versus looking actually much more sophisticated. And it's essential if you're going to have believable character motion. So what I'm talking about with blending is actually using multiple animations at once. So take an example. If you capture animations of a character walking, jogging, running, for example, then in the most simple implementation of your game, you pick, is my character walking, jogging, or running? And you just play that animation, and you switch from one to the other to the other. And this is pretty basic stuff, and it never looks right. What you can do is instead always be using all three of those animations, and you blend different amounts of them at once. Right? So this then gives you completely smooth control from, my guy might be going a slow walk, a faster walk, and so on and so on. And you can smoothly change all of these things. And again, these are things that non-gamers, the mainstream audience, tend to notice a lot more than gamers who are just used to how things kind of should work, as it were. Now, if you haven't done anything with animation, this starts to sound a bit scary. You need to know a bit of technology. But the key thing is here, there are tools for dealing with this. Right? Other people have taken care of all of this. And actually, with the right tools, the difference between switching between animations and blending animations with correct footstep retiming and all that sort of thing is like a couple of mouse clicks. It's no more work to do one rather than the other. It's just about thinking about it. And in fact, having these data-driven tools, that means that artists can just drop in different animation techniques, different blending techniques. They can test, they can iterate, they can deploy really, really quickly. You're not waiting on developers with understanding of animation. The guys that make your animation clips can control how they work in-game. So there are lots of tools out there now. There are standalone middleware solutions. That's obviously a large part of Natural Motion's business. We license this technology. I'm not here to sell that now. I'll also say there are lots of good in-game options, the in-engine options. So, you look at Unreal Engine with the Anim Tree stuff. Unity's just put out a new animation system. These tools are out there, and I would strongly, strongly suggest anyone looking at 3D gaming on mobile now spends what time they can getting to know the possibilities. Because there are not many experts out there in this industry at the moment, because not a lot of people are doing 3D character animation in mobile. There's a lot to learn, but the benefits are huge if you can get those compelling characters in. So, animation blending will take care of most of getting your character around the world. But your game characters very rarely live in a kind of featureless plane, right? Generally, you've got stuff in your game world. And if you want your characters to really be believable, you need your characters to interact with this stuff. They need to be able to pick up objects around them. They need to be able to put their hands on things. They need their feet to actually stay on the ground when the ground isn't flat and that sort of thing. And all of these interactions require animation. And you've got the risk of huge complexity. As soon as you've got lots of stuff in the environment and you want your characters to believably interact with it, the complexity can go through the roof. And your options for managing this, again, slightly limited. You can obviously keep your environment and interactions as simple as possible. That's the best thing to do. If you can do this without compromising your game, without compromising believability, it's the thing to do. Put less in. Your other option, just create loads of animations. That's the way that a lot of console devs have worked for a long time, but it's going to cost you a lot of money. The other option is to be smart and make use of the CPU that you've got. And start to look at the possibilities of using procedural animation. So procedural animation is basically any kind of animation where you're creating motion on the fly using a CPU during gameplay. And this is something that sometimes kind of scares people, the idea of actually just using CPU power for this kind of stuff. But actually these days the CPU cost is completely negligible on current mobiles. It's really not an issue. What's much more of an issue is dealing with the storage that you need for creating all of your animations. So where you can remove animations and replace them with things like inverse kinematics, do it. So examples of the kind of things you can do with IK. You might want to, say, be able to reach for a bottle that's in any kind of location, right? All you need to do is create a single reaching animation, right? That's one clip to reach for a generic location. IK then lets you change that target to a whole range of places. So dynamically, the game will say, this is where the bottle actually is. IK will fix up where the hand goes. This can obviously make your character much more believable in how he interacts with the world, and it reduces your animation budget. It's a no-brainer. Likewise, things like you want a character to walk along the ground. Maybe you've created animations of walking on a flat surface, you need him to walk up a slope. Don't go creating a whole load more animations for walking up slopes. Just make sure you've got an IK system that can automatically correct for this. They're out there they exist, and importantly, they exist as commercial products. You don't have to develop, you can buy them in. And a good example, again, something a bit different. In My Horse, one of the things that happens early on in the game is your horse walks over to you and you can pet your horse. And so you can kind of stroke the nose of the horse. And what we want to do is have the horse react. This is a kind of key bonding moment. And so what we do is we just have the horse kind of move its head to follow the motion that the player's doing. It takes one IK node. All you need is to take your animation, pass it through IK, feed in where the player's stroking the screen, and you can have the horse react accordingly. And when you've got the tools to author your animation system properly, this is literally 30 seconds work to drop in an IK node. It's no different to when you drop in an animation blend. It's drag and drop in your tool chain. Tiny bit of coding to hook up some parameters. This is why it's worth everyone kind of actually looking at the tools, because the tools hide the complexity of the animation. The last area to look at in terms of animation, I think, is the possibilities now of working with physics. So physics in games is something I'm really interested in. I've been working with it my whole professional career. And really the dynamic environments that you can get with physical simulation offer huge amounts of engaging gameplay opportunities. You can simulate the motion of anything. So typical things, big stack of boxes. We've got that essentially in our Jenga game. We have a physical stack of boxes you can just move around. And what's really interesting with mobile in particular is that we've got the touch interfaces. And the touch interfaces give you a whole new way of working with physics. It really works well because you've got a natural reaction of objects to a player input. The player has a natural way of interacting with the world by just touching and dragging, and with physics simulation, the objects that they're moving behave in a natural and expected way. So whilst things behave as expected, you also get the possibility for emergent behavior from the natural chaos that you get with a physical simulation. You never know as a developer exactly what's going to happen, and that means also as a player you don't know exactly what's going to happen. And so we've seen, I think because of this, physics titles are quite often popular. They burst in the charts occasionally, but they rarely have a lot of longevity. And I think part of that is down to the fact that the characters are not there in a lot of physics games. A vast number of physics games are obviously 2D simple physics, but when you do get characters in physics games, they tend to be ragdolls. So you've got these lifeless things you throw around. It's kind of fun throwing a ragdoll around occasionally, but it's not really engaging. You never become attached to that character. You don't have that retention of players wanting to come back and see what's happened to their ragdoll, because what will have happened is it will have fallen over again. So actually starting to look at how you can have physics simulation and engaging characters together, I think is a very interesting possibility. We're just at the point now where the technology is there on mobile. It's still pretty new. So at Natural Motion, we've developed our Euphoria system. It's a system that takes a physics simulation and adds a level of AI on top of it, a level of decision making and muscle modeling of a character to create intelligent reactions. So this is now technology that we've got running live on device, so it runs on iOS. I unfortunately can't show you on device here, so I'm showing within my authoring environment here. But to give you an idea of the kind of things that we can do now, as I say, we can do all of this actually on mobile. I've got a character here who has two animations. We've only got two animations in here. We've got a standing idle animation, and we've got a get up if the character falls over. Everything else is procedural. Everything else is being simulated, and as I say, this runs in real time on iPad, on iPhone as well. So you can see the character's able to look around. I can tell him where to look. In this case, he's looking at a mouse cursor. You can imagine he can look at your finger if you move your finger around. He's looking, but he's also balancing at the same time. You can see how his weight shifts naturally. He looks in a very natural way at my finger, or in this case, the cursor. Of course, I can push him as well. I can knock him around. I can prod him. In this case, obviously with a big purple arrow, but you can imagine doing this with, with your finger. You tap, and the guy responds. And again, I haven't had to create loads of animations for this. This is being computed on the fly. Likewise, I can just play with the environment. I can move objects around. So if I grab this box, I can move it over him, and he responds. He tries to protect himself. He'll duck away from it. I can bash him with it. And this is all being computed on the fly. I've had no animation production costs in creating this. It's all about using physical simulation and our AI technology. And you can see, hopefully, how this suits itself incredibly well to kind of touch interfaces. It suits itself to a mainstream audience. And you get a very compelling character at the end of it. So I'm pretty much out of time. So to give you my kind of summary of things, really. Mobile games, high-end mobile, will go 3D. And once it really goes 3D, I think opportunities for 2D will start to shrink. The mainstream audience will demand high-end 3D. And characters in 3D are incredibly important. Once you've got characters in there, you get this engagement and retention. And animation is a huge, huge part of creating those believable characters. Don't just focus on your rendering, on your modeling. Look at how your character moves and interacts with the world. If you're new to this, look at the tools that are out there. There are great tools. They save you a vast amount of effort, and they allow you to take advantage of these kind of procedural techniques, these physical simulation techniques that I think really will kind of change how people expect to interact with their characters in games. So I'll wrap things up there and make way for Nick, who will follow me. But thank you all for your time. Thanks for listening, and I'll take any questions if you've got them.